We're here with Joe Berlinger, one of the more talked about films here at the Sundance Film Festival. Whitey, of course, about the infamous head of the Winter Hill Gang, Whitey Bulger. And you got involved only very recently, Joe. Talk a little bit about how that came about, and was it difficult to get the kind of access you seem to get?
Yeah, you know, the fact that we're sitting here talking about a film that's playing at Sundance that I only started shooting in June is pretty miraculous on so many levels. But, you know, this is a story that has long fascinated me. As you know, it's fascinated many people. Here's a guy who for 25 years was, reigned over Boston's criminal empire, and yet was never, no one ever attempted to prosecute him. He wasn't stopped for a traffic ticket, not even a misdemeanor, and yet he was killing and extorting and doing all sorts of terrible things. And yet, at the same time, he's a guy who's just engendered all of this mythology. I can't think of another figure. I mean, we're on a first name basis with him. You say Whitey and you know who that is, and he has kind of emerged in the popular culture almost as a folk hero, and yet he's responsible for so many horrifying crimes. So I've long been fascinated by his story, but I never imagined I would do a documentary about it because there's a whole glut of a dozen books have been written, multiple movies. So I never thought I had anything to add. Until he was actually apprehended. And frankly, I never, as a longtime follower of his story, I never thought he would even be apprehended because I thought the FBI was giving him a free pass. But when he was apprehended, a new breed of FBI came in and decided enough was enough, and he was apprehended. And when it was announced that he was going to be put on trial this summer, that to me seemed like a real opportunity because this trial promised to be the biggest legal proceeding in Massachusetts since perhaps the 1920s, the Sacco and Vanzetti murder trials. And it also promised to be an opportunity to kind of separate fact from fiction, to understand who this guy is and how he operated, and to remove all that mythology that has grown up around him. And so it just seemed like a great opportunity to use the present tense springboard of a trial to look back at these 30 years of a very sordid history.
And one of the things that is really surprising when you talk about this, all this material and all this stuff we think we know, and then what it turns out you've uncovered, there are a lot of things I think that we kind of come out of the film reevaluating, but maybe most notable among them is just what Whitey's relationship with the FBI was. And it's striking to me that, and I'm sure it is for many who've seen the film, that, we tend to think of, Whitey was just, kind of an informant who was helping the FBI catch all his rivals and other people he worked with or against, that in fact they were often informing him, and that there was a real complicity going on there on the part of the FBI. I wonder if you could just address that a little bit, because it's a fascinating aspect of the film, and one that I think really turns on its head what we think we know about him.
Yeah, well, the film, I think, does confront a lot of the accepted beliefs about Whitey on many levels, but most notably on the whole question of whether or not he was an informant. And look, I don't know if he was an informant or not. I can't tell you, that I know more than the many great journalists who have covered this story. But the evidence that he might not have been an informant is very compelling, and it seems to have been swept under the rug. And much to my dismay, the question about whether or not he was an informant at the trial really was kind of treated by the journalists covering the trial. Again, I don't want to knock the journalism, because much of the journalism has been incredible and has uncovered much of this corruption. But it was surprising to me that the media covering the trial, generally speaking, kind of treated the question of whether or not he was an informant as a sideshow that the defense was just kind of trying to distract the jury with, when in fact it's a central issue in understanding the history of this case. Because if Whitey Bulger, first of all, it's bad enough if he was an informant and the FBI, while he was an informant, was allowing him to murder and commit horrendous crimes with their knowledge, because his murders were less important than bringing down the mob, which was the national agenda as set by J. Edgar Hoover a few decades before to bring down the La Cosa Nostra. That's bad enough that there was corruption at that level, that he was allowed to reign with impunity. But if it is what the defense has tried to put forward, and what Bulger in the film says himself, that he was not an informant at all, that he was paying them, that they were giving him information, and that the Justice Department was simply using his name and falsifying affidavits in support of search warrants in their desire to bring down the mob. If that is true, and again, I'm not saying it is true, but these are questions that need to be looked into. If it is true that Whitey Bulger, in fact, was not an informant, he was simply paying people off, and people died as a result, and these search warrants were falsified, a lot of these mob convictions could be overturned. And then there's the question of tremendous civil liability for families of victims who got killed in the crossfire. So it's a deeply important question, and was treated at the trial as if it was a sideshow issue.
And you mentioned, the criminal, the potential overturns and the civil issues. There's also a moral issue or an ethical issue, it seemed to me, watching the film.
Without
I mean, the
question.
Boston FBI particularly, and kind of how much sort of they were involved in, as you said, kind of aiding what Bulger was doing, and to somewhat questionable ends. What did you come out? I know the film presents sort of a fairly complex picture, but what did you come out believing about how deep that ran and how culpable morally, some of the FBI and the agencies who are working with Bulger are?
Well, I don't want to say that I presume to know the truth, but what I will say is that there are a lot of unanswered questions that were not examined at this trial, that were not examined deeply enough by the press covering the trial, and that anyone who cares about the integrity of our institutions has a vested interest in knowing what the truth is. At the end of the trial, U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts, Carmen Ortiz, stood in front of the press, gave a press conference, and said, with the conviction of James Bulger, this ugly history in Boston is now over. But it's not over until you know exactly what the truth is and how he was allowed to reign over this criminal empire. And I have to say, I am not an apologist for Bulger. He was a brutal, vicious killer. He deserves to be behind bars. I think he believed he deserved to be behind bars. He wasn't really, his defense was about getting the truth out, not so much about trying to walk out of the courthouse steps.
Well, I know we have to wrap, but the last question, we focused a little bit about some of the people and institutions he worked with, but did you come out with Whitey, you come in making a movie about Whitey Bulger, you hear about some of the things he did, some of the victims, and you've got some of the relatives of those victims in the film, and it's extremely compelling, but we also realized that there was an element of, he wasn't maybe, even though he very much deserves to be in jail, that much is clear, but that there were people around him who certainly stood to gain by his downfall. And I wonder if, it seems to me that it's a movie like maybe some others we've seen where the disgraced personality comes out, if not looking more sympathetic, at least a little more nuanced, and the picture isn't quite as clear even on someone as villainous as Whitey Bulger.
Exactly. And again, this is not an apology for Whitey Bulger, but when you hear from him directly for the first time, because this is the first media, of all the books and movies that have been written, this is the first and only project he's ever cooperated in. When you hear from him, he becomes a much more three-dimensional character. Again, he does not deserve our sympathies for the many things that he did, but he does deserve and should have had a full and meaningful defense. One of the themes of this film was that in his defense, the government greatly narrowed the scope of inquiry. He was not allowed to call certain witnesses. He was not allowed to present his immunity defense. The prosecution kept saying that the question of his informancy status was irrelevant. For me, those are central issues, and a basic tenet of our justice system is to allow people to present a full and meaningful defense, even if you might think his defense of immunity is ludicrous. How could somebody have a license to kill? But if he believes that this is his defense, he should have been allowed to present it, because there's too many swirling questions of corruption that have yet to be answered, and too many people who are potentially responsible for this horrendous level of malfeasance that happened in Boston, who have gone unaccounted for. And that's the purpose of the film, not to acquit Whitey Bulger, but to say that there are questions surrounding his defense that should have been answered.
It's a fascinating film, and I think, as is often the case in these stories, where the person we think, they may well be, the subject may well be who we think they are, but there are a lot of other factors, and you say people around them, that complicate that picture. Joe, I want to thank you for coming in and talking about the film.
Thanks for talking to me.